Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. It's my pleasure to welcome you, and particularly David Hart, back to CIS. Now, some of you know that David Hart is probably the only other person in this room, other than me, who was there at the start. David and I shared a house in... we were there at the inception. Conception, perhaps, yes. Shared a house in Pennant Hills in the sort of mid-70s, and of course that's where, for those who know a little bit about CIS history, that's where the famous CIS shed is. It's not there anymore. Sorry, was. It's not there anymore. David's a Sydney sider, as you'll find out. He did his undergraduate studies at Macquarie University, writing a thesis on the radical anti-statist thought of the Belgian-French political economist Gustave de Molinari. After spending a year in Germany studying German imperialism and the origins of the First World War at the University of Mainz, he completed an MA in history at Stanford. While at Stanford, he worked on student programs for the Institute for Humane Studies, and of course we have our own student program here, Liberty and Society, which was sort of copied or developed from the idea at IHS. And in fact, the next Liberty and Society program is this coming weekend, and David will be one of the speakers, amongst others Oliver Hartwich is also. Okay, he was a founding editor of the Humane Studies Review when he was at IHS. He received a PhD in history from King's College, Cambridge, on the work of two leading French classical liberals of the early 19th century, Charles Comte and Comte. Oh, okay, it doesn't read like that. And Charles Dunoyer, who pioneered liberal class theory of history. He then taught for 15 years at the University of Adelaide, where he was awarded the University Teaching Prize. Since 2001, he has been the director of the online Library of Liberty project at Liberty Fund in Indianapolis, in America. This library has won several awards, including Best of the Humanities on the Web Award from the National Endowment for the Humanities in 2006. If you want to go and find some of the best books about the ideas that we're interested in, that's the place to go. His research interests include the history of classical liberal thought, war and culture, and film and history. And tonight, his talk will be something quite different to anything else we've had here. And I think I'm quite pleased we were able to do this, because one of the sort of missing elements of a lot of the debates and so on we have here is culture and you know, the broader sort of ideas which are expressed through cartoons and art and film and so forth. So this should be a terrific presentation. So thanks again, David.
My pleasure. Thank you very much. I'm going to do things a little bit differently tonight. Poor old Angus is going to have to follow me around the room, because I like to leap and jump about when I have artwork on the screen pointing out interesting things for you. So I won't be standing here behind the lectern for much of the time. The second thing is that it's a fairly modular presentation, because I want to look at particular images of art and look at the politics that is contained in those pictures. And I'll stop for questions at the end of each image, so that you can think about what I've been talking about and then formulate some questions or some discussion points. And then I'll move on to the next one. So I won't leave question and answers to the end. So please feel free at any time to jump in and say something or comment. That'll be perfectly fine by me. I got interested in the politics of art when I was teaching first-year students in European history at the University of Adelaide. And part of the problem was to try and make history more approachable to students. I mean, we all have this problem teaching that students just don't seem to be interested in anything older than 5 years, especially anything that's foreign, like European, French, German, whatever. So the idea was to try and show them that certain conflicts of ideas in particular, can be or were represented in art or music or opera, and that this is one way in which the battle of ideas was fought. And that we can learn more about the battle of these ideas by looking at some of these works of culture. And I've made a selection tonight of some of the more interesting ones that I've found over the course of time. One of my favourite ones, this is sort of like the logo for my first year history course at Adelaide, was famous painting by the Romantic painter Eugene Delacroix, "Liberty leading the people at the barricade" in 1830. And we can see the troops have been firing on French citizens. They have fallen, but there's a group of sort of typical Parisians, workers, a child even, a soldier, and a woman which is the graphical representation of liberty. Her name was Marianne, and she was the model for the Statue of Liberty, which was a gift from the French people to America to celebrate the 100th anniversary of the Declaration of Independence. And that is the figure of Marianne, which has become a very important part of French political culture from the French Revolution onwards. And the second painting I have here is not obviously not a classical liberal depiction here. This is a bunch of very happy communists in China. But what I was interested in was a very similar structure. I mean, here we have a pyramid with a woman. Here we also have a pyramid of characters featuring two women prominently in the lead, again with her hand stretched out, pointing the way forward to the great and glorious socialist future. When I went to Shanghai a couple of years ago, one of the things I wanted to see was a privately owned propaganda poster museum, which was in the basement of an apartment building run by a couple of guys who'd grown up in the 1960s in China and their whole lives had been saturated with propaganda from the Communist Party. And when the communist system began to disintegrate and the great economic reforms of 1978 were introduced, a lot of people just started throwing away this propaganda. And these two guys said, no, we should collect it because it's so much a part of our life and our culture. So I go to this propaganda museum, which is just a fantastic collection of political garbage and nonsense, urging the communist people to do what their government tells them to do and work hard for the revolution and sacrifice endlessly. And I bought several $100s worth of communist propaganda material, which I took back to Indianapolis. And I had this round table in my office where I had all these posters, and I had a little statue of Mao, and I had a Red Guard Army band to police ideological purity on the second floor where I work. I had a little Mickey Mouse watch with Mao's face on it, with his hand going like this to indicate the second. I had it all spread out beautifully because I like to collect this stuff. And I had a surprise visit from an officer from the Department of Homeland Security. I was in the middle of the last stages of getting my green card, which is permanent residency in the US. And I was away in Chicago on a trip. And he made a surprise visit because they wanted to, after 8 years of living in the US, he wanted to make sure that my application was not fraudulent. And he wanted to make sure that Liberty Fund was in fact a serious scholarly organisation. And he was taken on a guided tour of the premises, including my office, where he proceeded to photograph my office, including my collection of communist propaganda, which I thought was a little strange. But it didn't affect my green card application. I did eventually get that. But it's on file somewhere.
Could I ask you on the image?
Yes.
Apart from the pyramid shape, I do also see the color, red and blue.
Red
and blue.
Yes, red is the symbol of revolution and revolt.
In both cases.
Blue is the sign of blue sky, that, new vistas opening up.
So both the communists as well as everybody uses that.
But I think they're borrowing from the French revolutionary tradition because they would have seen the communist revolution as another step in the great forward march of human freedom. So there are clear borrowings there. Let me just ask, what do I mean by liberty? What do I mean by power? And liberty can mean a whole lot of things, including just pictures about people at liberty doing stuff they want to do, and I'm not really interested in that. I'm interested in the politics. So in many cases, artists or composers were liberals, especially in the late 18th and 19th century. They had a worldview which you would describe as a classical liberal one. And those views did affect the way what subjects they chose and how they represented them. You might find this hard to believe because you would probably think today that most artists and composers and so on are left-wing. But that wasn't the case in the 19th century. They were very much liberal. So we want to look at paintings that were done by people who had liberal views or liberal assumptions about the world. There's a celebration of bourgeois values, that being a peaceful, hard-working person is a good thing. And this is depicted sometimes in art. Then we have sort of more politically minded artists who want to promote liberty by using their art. So the depictions of Marianne, for example, served a positive political purpose of reinforcing the notion that freedom was a good thing. And then, of course, they use art to oppose or critique the institutions of power, politics, rulers, and so on, particular policies that people don't like or that these liberals don't like. And so it does serve this sort of critical purpose. Here we have another image of Marianne. And this is, anyone know what this is? The Phrygian cap, which was the headdress that freed slaves supposedly wore in the Roman Empire. When you were freed, you were allowed to wear this Phrygian cap. And so in the 18th century, that became a symbol of someone who had been freed from tyranny. And so you see constantly this Phrygian cap. And that's definitely, this is from 1793. And she's got, instead of a sword in hand, which is another way in which Marianne is represented, she's got a scroll of the laws. She's a conservative, law-abiding Marianne, not a sort of Amazonian, kill the tyrants type Marianne. But we see both in French art. And then the opposite view is, the idea of power. Often it's used for propaganda purposes. Leaders like Napoleon wanted to be depicted in the most favourable light, and they would use artists and composers sometimes to show this. This is a pure piece of propaganda because this is a painting which shows Napoleon crossing the Alps into Italy. And if you know anything about his invasion of Italy, he did not do it on a horse like this. He rode a donkey, but that's very unsexy. You can't really have a propaganda painting showing you sitting on a donkey, So he has himself on this rearing steed, which of course it would slip on the rocks, and you'll see here it's got a number of names of other great conquerors like Bonaparte and Hannibal. So he's making a connection here with with previous invaders. So some of the things that art has been used to defend people in power is to legitimise the ruler, to justify their actions, to make them loved or feared by their subjects, to overawe or subdue their opponents, or to ensure sacrifice to the state or the nation according to the needs of the government. So there's some of the sort of general intellectual framework that I'm using to analyse some of this art. And I have work of art or discussions of this at two places. The Online Library of Liberty, which is the official Liberty Fund website. I have a series which is about 30 or 40 sort of short essays where I take an image, analyse it and try and pair it with a quote from the period to show some more about the political and liberal background, intellectual background to it. And I also have my personal website, davidmhart.com, where I do something similar. Some of the more outrageous things I say on my personal website I couldn't really say on the Liberty Fund corporate website. Here we have another picture of Marianne, right, symbol of liberty. And she's an aggressive Amazonian type Marianne, right? She's got the torn, sometimes exposed breast. She's got the yoke of tyranny that she's broken. She's got an axe here and she's slaying the multi-headed monster of tyranny. So she's a very aggressive Marianne. So these are some of the things I could talk about. I won't have time to talk about all of them, but I'll offer you the chance to choose one if you wish. I have a number of pro-power depictions. So Washington and Napoleon, the official portraits of them in their study. The way in which Washington and Lincoln were turned into godlike figures in official American art. And then some of the propaganda about rationing and price controls in World War II. Then I have an Australian interlude because I want to insert some Australian content here. Then I have a collection of images that are critical of power. Some cartoons against war and taxes during the Napoleonic period. And when we see some of those, you'll see that nothing has changed in 200 years. Right? The same criticisms are there. Press censorship by Delacroix. Before he became a successful painter, he was a cartoonist. And he got some great anti-censorship cartoons, which of course were censored eventually. And then ruling class in the caricatures of Wade and Dormier. And it's interesting that Greg has published a book where one of these cartoons is prominently displayed on the cover, and I'll give you some background to that if you wish. Then I have another Australian interlude. And then some pro-liberty images. Thomas Hollis and the way in which he promoted books by also using beautiful images to go with the books, because he thought that beautiful things should accompany truth. And liberty was a truth, therefore it should be accompanied by beautiful images. And he, I think of him a bit like as a 18th century Liberty Fund, distributor of beautiful, well-made, attractive books. Then some French Revolutionary playing cards. Why have kings and queens on your deck of cards when you've just had a revolution to overthrow monarchy? Right? You need something that's going to be in keeping with your own Republican principles. And some enterprising entrepreneurs, in fact, made a set of cards and tried to sell them. And they're very interesting to revealing their views before the terror hit and wiped out this liberal phase of the revolution in France. And then I have a whole lot more about Marianne, which we could look at. And then instead of having monuments to depict great military or political leaders, I have examples here of monuments to depict great free traders, people who struggled, like Richard Cobden and Frederick Bastiat, to bring about free trade, and how their supporters recognised their contribution by raising money and then erecting statues to them. So there's the possibility. Do you have any particular choice? I'll let you choose if you wish. Price controls. Obviously an economist is speaking here. All right, let me go through and I'll get my price controls. Here we go. This is the image of a ration book that was issued in America in 1943. And what's very interesting about this is, I mean, it's obviously very bureaucratic, but it has a warning here. Now, what I did on the online Library of Liberty website was I paired this with a critique of rationing and price controls by Ludwig von Mises, who had moved to America from Switzerland in 1940. And he wrote a number of very penetrating books attacking fascism in Germany, but also the emerging fascism in America. And he regarded price controls and limits on people's economic freedoms as a kind of fascism. And this was a ration book here with this warning. Now, I'll just read out this warning. It's sort of fine print. This book is the property of the United States government. It is unlawful to sell it to any other person or to use it or permit anyone else to use it, except to obtain ration goods in accordance with regulations of the Office of Price Administration. Any person who finds a lost war ration book must return it to the War Price and Rationing Board, which issued it. Persons who violate rationing regulations are subject to a $10,000 fine, imprisonment, or both. Do you know how much $10,000 in 1943 would be worth today? $130,000. Right, so this is violating the rationing rules here is a serious, serious breach of the law, which the US government would crush immediately. But of course they didn't stop people smuggling and dealing on the black market and counterfeiting these books and violating it, because the economy would not work if price controls were introduced. And here's a propaganda poster from 1943 from the Office of Price Administration. Here we have, it's like a cartoon with a before and after. Right? Without rationing, there is nothing on the shelves. This imperious-looking woman has bought everything in the shop, and the second woman has nothing. Right? So that is what, without rationing, this is going to be the situation according to these propagandists. However, bottom panel, with rationing, the store is completely full, everyone is smiling, each one gets one can, and everyone's happy. Right? That's the propaganda behind. So rationing means a fair share for all of us. This was the Office of Price Administration in 1943. That's a larger one. This is the back of the ration book with even more threatening, if you don't need it, don't buy it. Right? Because they needed fats for explosives, they needed rubber for tanks, they needed petrol for tanks and aircraft. And so people were persuaded not to privately use any of these goods. Here's a larger version of that propaganda poster. Now, the reason I thought this was quite interesting is because it reverses the propaganda of the free trade movement from the early 19th century. Right? This was a Liberal Party poster in the campaign of 1907 when tariffs were... there was a campaign to increase tariffs quite dramatically. And we see here the Liberal Party, it's hard to believe, but the Liberal Party then was pro-free trade. And so this is before and after. When you have free trade, the free trade shop is absolutely stocked full of food at reasonable prices. What happens after when you introduce protection, we see the protection shop where the shelves are half empty. There is all sorts of you know, broken glass because people have been trying to break in and steal the food. The prices are much higher. And this is, you know, the Liberal Party propaganda campaign from 1907 with the exact reverse of what we saw in the previous image, which I thought was quite interesting. And this is one of my favourite propaganda posters from this period, 1943, right, trying to make people feel guilty about driving and wasting fuel by driving alone. Right, that if you, the implication here is if you drive, selfishly drive all by yourself with no one else in the car, no carpooling, there is the shadowy figure of Hitler sitting next to you. Right, you are a secret sympathiser with the Nazis if you don't carpool. Join a car sharing club today. Right, I think this is a marvellous poster. When you ride alone, you ride with Hitler.
Today it's just a crime against climate change.
Well, that's one reason why I include it, because this argument persists today. That if you know, what I found interesting, I was looking at the Qantas website to check some details about checking in, and you could tax yourself. Right, there's a little button you can, you know, offset, you know, carbon by paying extra. But now we have people taxing themselves. This is extraordinary. So that's my.
Okay, go to this one.
You want to see an Australian interlude? Okay. I recently gave, or earlier this year, I gave a talk at San Jose State University on Bastiat. I was at the economics department, which were quite free market, and they invited me to come and talk about Frederick Bastiat. And some of my friends took me for a guided tour of the campus. And San Jose State is now a very left-wing campus. So it was very surprising for there to be a group of free market people in the economics department. But this was very interesting because this was the statue that was built and opened to the public in 2005. And does anyone know what that is? Yes, the Mexico Olympic Games, where two American athletes from San Jose State made they won gold, some medals. There's one came in first and one came in third. And instead, when they were on the dais to collect their medals, they did the Black Power salute, which caused all sorts of controversy back in the United States. And I thought this was a very interesting piece of propaganda, politically correct propaganda. Do you know why I would think that?
Because there's nobody on number two.
There's no, but who was number two? He was white, and he was an Australian, right? Which is why this is called an Australian interlude. Okay, so I did some searching, and that is the official picture. Peter Norman, and he was instrumental in this because they needed, the two African American athletes needed his support to do this, and he supported it wholeheartedly. One of them forgot their pair of gloves, and it was Peter Norman who suggested, well, why don't one of you wear the right-hand glove and the other one wear the left-hand glove, which they did. That's why they have their hands like this, you see, because they left one pair of gloves back in the changing room. But, to go back to this, imagine if a white Southern college erected a statue of two white athletes and left off the single black athlete. I mean, that's interesting, isn't it? So I felt an obligation for both political and nationalistic reasons to do a reenactment. So here we have a less than athletic but Australian figure standing here on number two, and I got my friend to take a snapshot. So that's a sort of modern example of the politics of art. I mean, leaving out the white Australian who came second because they wanted to celebrate, you know, the black heroes of their college. So that's my Australian interlude. Any other thoughts? I can zip back to the beginning.
Delacroix, please.
Delacroix, the cartoon when he was.
Yeah.
Let's see if I can get this. There we go. We've got that. Cartoons. There we go. Now, what's interesting here is that in the chaos after the defeat of Napoleon and before the restored Bourbon monarchy was able to fully re-establish its power, there was a period of press freedom in France. And all sorts of newspapers and journals sprang up in order to express views about constitutional government, about the need for low taxes, you know, the same sort of things that you'd expect liberals to agitate for. And Delacroix was a young aspiring artist who made money at this time doing cartoons for liberal newspapers to make money. And here's an anonymous cartoon, and it shows a whole lot of figures which represent various journals with political viewpoints being harnessed, literally harnessed to the wagon of state. Right? The state has got them all under control. And this was a particularly irritating journal called the Yellow Dwarf, which used to satirise and mock political leaders. And it's just about to be extinguished. That French says, "S'agit la naine jeune." Here lies the dead yellow dwarf. And he's just about to have the shell stamp out here. And here he's got the lamp of enlightenment and criticism. But up here is one journal which is flying free, right? It can't be stifled by the government censorship. And that happens to be one of the journals and one of the writers that I wrote my PhD on. Never before depicted in art, so I was really excited when I saw this. He's like a Roman god, a Roman hero, riding a Pegasus, and he's got bolts of lightning that he's been hurling down at the corrupt political establishment, and he's got a mirror here shining the enlightenment and criticism of what he sees. So this was from 1815. Here's one by Delacroix. And this was there were periods of loose censorship and tightened censorship all through the 1810s. And in 1822, it seemed like censorship was going to be finally eliminated. And so this is a cartoon celebrating the fact that the censors have been driven from their office, right? This is now a building to let, right? This is where they actually exercise their function as censors, and they've been driven out, and there are some happy citizens here. And here's a bunch of censors sitting in a wagon being dragged by some poor old horse here, and the horse rider or the leader is the devil, and they're all going to hell, right? And we see these are the symbols of the censor, right? The scissors, which they used to cut out the various passages which they didn't like. And these scissors now have wings, and they are flying free, disappearing. There's going to be no more censorship. And if you, all these characters here represent various figures in the French establishment, and their figures are based upon their names. So one of them was called Pain, and he's drawn as a sugar cone, because the name Pain means bread or here's another one by Delacroix from 1822. And this is interesting because here we have all the younger people, the people who were in favour of the revolution, marching down this street towards the Arc de Triomphe, which was being built at the time to celebrate the people who'd fallen in the French Revolution. And here we have, this is one of the key censors. You can see he's shaped like a sugar cone, sugar cake. And there's the symbol here, the flag of the censors. And he's riding on a lobster backwards. And this has some meaning, which was people thought that lobsters actually walked backwards for some strange reason. And here are all the defenders of the old regime, the censors, are going backwards because they're not with the forces of history. The forces of history are going towards the Arc de Triomphe. And these censors and the members of the old regime are literally going backwards in time, sitting on the backs of these lobsters. And people think that this is in fact a self-representation of Delacroix, who's blowing a whistle in derision at the censors. So that's the young Delacroix. Yes?
Do you, irrespective of politics, do you come to the conclusion that we'll find the better art from those who are oppressed rather than those who are actually running the place?
That's a very good question, and I'm not sure I have an answer. I like this art because it's politically interesting. If I were an art critic, I would have different views.
Thinking of the difference, say, between Les Miserables and the North Korean celebration of the leader.
Yes.
There's so much more scope in suffering, and artists traditionally suffer. You get the best
Yes.
art from the garret
Yes, the suffering does focus the mind considerably.
That's the Daumier.
That's the Daumier,
It's
yes.
on our book, yes.
Yes, but I think in the case of Delacroix, we have an example there of someone who, in his youth, was politically motivated to do those cartoons, and that political interest continued, at least in his 1830 painting. But then he became more abstract and less involved with day-to-day politics. So I think he grew beyond that youthful, radical political phase, which I think many artists do. And yet, someone like Picasso comes to politics later in life. You know, his famous painting Guernica, which is a very political anti-war painting he did in 1937, he did as a relatively older man. So, you know, his best years were perhaps behind him.
I can't think of any art that I like from the winners.
From the winners. Well,
You know,
Jacques-Louis David did a lot of propaganda paintings for Napoleon, and a lot of those are very, very good paintings. So, you know, but I think you're probably right. I mean, they're being paid by the state to produce propaganda, and they do it to order. And maybe that's not the best recipe for art.
Was there a Nazi one on Guernica, seen from the air in the marvellous pictures and the colours?
No, I don't think there was a Nazi version of Guernica. But why don't we look at this one here, these two interesting caricatures of the ruling elite, because you chose it as your book cover, it seems appropriate to look at that. This is one from 1835, and this comes from a book by John Wade called The Extraordinary Black Book. And John Wade was a radical reformer who wanted to democratise British politics because it was dominated by vested interests and ruling elites, and he wanted to at least allow the middle class to vote for the first time, which is what happened in 1832 with the first Reform Act. Middle class people who paid a certain amount of tax could join the voting rolls, and that significantly increased the number of voters in Britain, and that's the beginning of liberal politics in Britain and the beginning of a whole series of reforms introduced by classical liberals, leading up to the Anti-Cornwall League, the abolition of tariffs in Britain in 1846. That was a result of the 1832 Reform Act. Anyway, in the Extraordinary Black Book, which went through many editions, John Wade listed all the people in England who got government benefits, whether they were in the church or the aristocracy or the military, and listed who got what and how much. It was very damning. You'd need more than one volume today to list all the people who get money from the Australian government. But he could do it in one book in 1835. And this was a cartoon or an illustration that accompanied the book. And here we see John Bull, which is, you know, that's John Bull in his hat. And he's like Gulliver, and the ruling elite are like the Lilliputians. Right? And Gulliver has been knocked over. He's been tied to the ground. You can see the stakes and the ropes here. And he's being looted by the establishment. Right? Literally, there's a guy here pilfering his money from his pockets. We have representatives of the law. We have the church. It's holding his tongue so he can't cry out in protest. We see the military. Here we see the military. And we see the people in the background looking on in shock and horror. And this was a very interesting graphical depiction of the notion of, amongst liberals at the time, of class oppression. Right? That there was a group of people who controlled the government who did so for their own benefit, and that they did so at the expense of the ordinary taxpayer. So some of you might think that class analysis like this is a Marxist notion. Actually, it's not. It was thought of and used first by classical liberals, and only later adapted by Marx for his socialist agenda.
What was the see up there? It looks like there's a sun and there's a man's head there.
There's a picture of a man.
That's right. I mean, people think that maybe that is John Wade himself looking down on. This is the graphical representation of what he says in his book, right? Who is looting the British taxpayer? What particular groups? And he's like the all-knowing author or god-like figure who can, you know, understand what's all happening.
Is it anti-Semitic?
I don't think so. Why would you say that?
I would just wonder on the imagery and of the particular time.
No, I don't think it's anti-Semitic. You can see some long-nosed people, but I think it's just making them look caricaturish. I don't think it's anti-Semitic. And if you go to my website, you can see a much more detailed analysis of who's in the picture and what it might mean. But I'll leave that if you want to go and look at it in detail. I don't have time tonight. But here's the second one, which I think is also interesting. This is Honoré Daumier's Gargantua. And Gargantua is the king. And Daumier got 6 months in jail for this. Right, so it came with a price. King Louis Philippe had the unfortunate physical characteristic of looking like a pear. And so what did the cartoonist draw him as? As a pear. And he would get angrier and angrier about this and try and fine them and imprison them, which only encouraged the cartoonist to continue to draw him as a pear. So that's partly why Daumier was put in jail. But this is a very interesting picture because, again, it shows a classical liberal idea of class exploitation by a ruthless exploiting state. And here we have, in this picture here, a township with buildings, and it looks like a port, fairly productive perhaps. Here we have a group of people who are taxpayers, and some of them are very poor people, right? They're in rags. Or this woman here is a child, and she's exhausted and sitting down. But what's happening is that they've been forced to come here to pay their taxes. And they're depositing their coins into these baskets. And these minions of the state are carrying these baskets up these steps and pouring it into the mouth of the king. Now this is the notion that the state is a tax eater. Right? That it takes our taxes and it uses it for their own benefit. Now this is not any old chair that Louis Philippe is sitting on. He's sitting on what the French decorously call a commode, which is actually a toilet. Right? So what goes in the royal mouth has to come out. And what is coming out? But all sorts of subsidies and privileges and handouts to the elite who are collecting these and then rushing off to the chamber to celebrate their victory over the taxpayers. Right, so this is a very clear picture of class exploitation through taxation. And this is from 1831. And again, if you go to my website, you can see a more detailed analysis of each of the parts of the illustration. Do we have any other preferences, or should I? Oh, there's I better go to this one. So who would have thought the magic pudding had political meaning? I don't think it was intentional. Here we have the magic pudding. He's a grumpy old bastard, isn't he? But to me, the magic pudding is a symbol of socialism. Now, why would I think that? Something for nothing, that's exactly right. It is a socialist dream that you can do away with the problem of scarcity. Right? Economists always say that there is, wherever you go, at any time, any place, a problem of scarcity. Right? We have more interests or demands or wishes that we want fulfilled than we have resources to do so. If we didn't have a problem of scarcity, we would be like living in the Garden of Eden. We could have anything we wanted, any time, any place. Those of you who are science fiction fans might know Star Trek. I think of that as a military socialist community where they have solved the problem of scarcity with what machine? The replicator. Right? Anything they want, any food, any drink, any item of clothing, whatever, they can create just like that with the replicator. Right? They have solved the problem, the economic problem of scarcity. And the same thing happens here, that no matter how many times you eat the magic pudding, it magically grows back and there is no problem of food scarcity.
And of course you have lots of different puddings too, that's satisfy everybody.
And I thought that was a remarkably interesting socialist image, that you could get something for nothing, that taxpayers think that the government can give them jobs, give them health insurance, they can give them welfare benefits. Where does that come from though? It doesn't come from a magic pudding which grows magically all by itself. It has to come from the taxpayers. Right, but here we have the socialist dream of a magic pudding. Perhaps I could do one here. I'll go to Marianne first. Let's see. So here we have some images of Marianne. And Marianne, I have suggested that there is the conservative image of Marianne and a radical image of Marianne. And the radical socialists and Jacobins liked this image of Marianne, right? That she is like an Amazon, right? She's always screaming in anger, ready to kill the tyrants. And she's got a sword in her hands, and she's leading the people to crush the tyrants through the use of violence. Right? That's one depiction of Marianne, the symbol of French liberty. This is a much more conservative one. Right? She's fully clothed, her bodice is not torn, she's got a Phrygian cap, but she's got no sword, and she's got the laws. Right? So she's a law-abiding Marianne. And the question is, which depiction of Marianne is the one that most accurately represents French aspirations? Well, neither one does. They're constantly toing and froing. In some French towns, every time a socialist mayor was elected, he would pull down the statue in the town square of the conservative Marianne and get out of storage the more radical statue of Marianne. And when the conservatives or the liberals got into power, they would tear down the radical image of Marianne and get out of storage the older conservative image of Marianne. So when it came to giving the Americans a birthday present, which one would they choose? France was completely divided on the question. Here's a close-up of Marianne with her mouth open and fierce. More detail there from...
Why a female figure rather than a male figure?
Because usually women were depicted as various, peace or virtue or sobriety, or that was the sort of classical tradition.
Like Colombia in America.
Colombia, yeah. That was the tradition, going back to the Greeks and Romans.
But the radical Marianne is pretty fierce.
She's very fierce, yes. And here we have another fierce Marianne with an axe, and she's been chopping, and you can see the tyrant's crown on the ground. She's trampling it. If you look closely at the Statue of Liberty in New York Harbour, if you look at the feet of Liberty, she is trampling chains. That's sort of like a version of this. Instead of crowns, she's the chains that bound people to tyranny were at her feet.
Might I ask?
Here's a black Marianne, by the way.
A couple of slides back, the more conservative picture of Marianne. What is the pyramid in the background, and does it represent anything at all?
It does represent. The idea was that there was antiquity and knowledge that came from Egypt. Greek science and mathematics had been inspired by ancient Egyptian examples. The Masons, the Masonic movement, also used the image of the pyramid to make that same point, that knowledge and enlightenment is ancient. And this was a symbol of antiquity and moderation, actually.
Do you think that the existence of Marianne as such a strong figure in French culture has influenced the burqa debate in that country?
I can't answer that question. I don't know. We don't see any Mariannes with burqas on. We see them with torn bodices, which I'll show you one eventually. Well, there's a torn bodice, so we can get excited about that. This is a very interesting one showing Marianne as a black ex-slave. I enjoy liberty like you. The French Republic is in accord with nature. Am I not your sister? Which was a very interesting claim for equality. And the French slaves were in fact liberated in the early phase of the French Revolution, but slavery was reintroduced by Napoleon. And it wasn't until 1848 in another French Revolution that slavery was finally abolished in France. But interestingly, there were some black representatives in the assembly in Paris in the early stage of the revolution. They were granted voting rights, and some of them were elected and took their seats in the assembly, which was very interesting.
One of the two previous ones,
That one?
The radical, yes, and that one, the coloured one, and the radical one, the juxtaposition of those is very interesting, because on the one hand you've got what looks like a nourishing female figure,
Yes.
and on the other a shaming female figure.
Yes.
In other words, for God's sake, men, come and follow me. Would you agree with that?
Yes,
There is a shaming element in that?
Well, she was meant to be Amazonian, right? That she was a warrior, and she was going to inspire and lead the men in the forcible conquest of Europe to free them from feudalism. That was the sort of dream. There are, in fact, images of Marianne, very full-breasted, suckling 2 children,
That's right.
one of which was the Republic and the other one was the Laws. So you're right, there was that sort of nourishing mother-type view of Marianne.
The other thing that strikes me, you know, it seems to bring many of them together, is the literary and symbolic condensation, which is very strong.
Yes.
Literary in the sense of telling a story.
Yes.
And lasting visibility.
That helps explain why it persisted for so long. This is a very rich symbol that can be reused by different political groups for their own purpose.
And also there's a strong aesthetic element.
Yes, they're all good-looking women. I mean, that's you wouldn't.
Well, I mean, they're well constructed, you know.
Yes, the symbolism is well
Very well
constructed.
constructed.
Yes, that's right. Here we have the Phrygian cap again and the staff, the spear. But you'll notice the spear is downward pointing, not upwards, like in an aggressive pose. And she's got the Roman fasces, which was a very common element. The idea was that you could break one stick, but if you bound them together in a bundle, they were unbreakable. So if the nation was united, no tyrant could destroy this united nation. That's a very common element. And then we can see, going back to Delacroix, you know, he's again using this image of the Marianne to make a point about the 1830 revolution. The last of the Bourbons, Charles X, reintroduced censorship and cracked down on political and other groups. That triggered a revolt in 1830 with the idea that a junior member of the Bourbon family would come to power and be a constitutional monarch, which he did for a while and then reverted back to his
You haven't shown the American, say the...
I will get to that. I will skip. There we go.
But is it, it seems to be the case that there's plenty of art related to the troubles in Europe,
Yes.
overthrowing monarchs and invading places and setbacks and the rest of it. But the New World has got an inspiring past. Where's our Eureka Stockade art? Is
Yeah.
there the art from the Civil War doesn't appear to have the strength that you've been showing from Delacroix. Is there something particular about the European experience that we relate to?
That's a very good question. I've thought about this for some time, and it partly could be explained by the fact that America was populated by Puritans who took a dim view of art. Right, whereas a lot of this is Catholic. I mean, Catholic symbolism, Catholic art, Catholic music, whereas the Dow Puritans sort of frowned on representations like this. That's a very crude
Well, Australians
answer.
didn't have Puritans, did they?
No.
What does that Puritan tradition then mean for the depiction of American presidents?
Well, I actually have a segment there on Washington and Napoleon in their studies, and if we have time, I'll get to that. How are we going for time?
Yeah,
Okay, well...
Another 10 minutes, yeah.
Another 10 minutes,
Yeah.
yep. Here we have a compromise image of Marianne. The radical Marianne had the arm raised with a sword. Here we have her arm raised, but she's got a torch of enlightenment. Right, so that's sort of a compromise. The conservative Marianne was always clutching the table of the laws. And we see her also clutching the laws here. And if you look at her feet, you can't see it in this photograph, but she is standing on the broken chains of tyranny, which was, again, a very common symbol. Either the broken chains of tyranny or the crown of monarchs or the decapitated heads of animals like snakes that represented tyrants. And this was the construction of the very large statue. The French spent a lot of money on this. They gave it to the Americans and it just sat in storage because the government refused to contribute any money to erecting it on a monument. So they had to raise money privately to buy the island and to make the pedestal and put the... But the government at that stage wasn't the slightest bit interested in erecting it, which is quite interesting. And then, of course, it had to be fully constructed and completed. There was a World Fair in 1878 and a reproduction of Marianne, or the Statue of Liberty, was used in Paris. It drew a lot of people. And then this is a placard or a poster announcing the Statue of Liberty, the unveiling of it in New York. And there's a painting from 1886 sort of celebrating this fact. It's a very patriotic American painting with all the fireworks going off and so on. But there's some very interesting books written about the Statue of Liberty and its history and how it was very controversial in France and America. What else can we do? Anyone else got any preferences? I might leave that for the moment and go to another one. Now, if the traditional way in which rulers were depicted in art, it goes back to the 17th century with French absolute monarchs wanting to be depicted in all their glory with their sumptuous clothes, their furs, their symbols of office and so on. And Napoleon, even though he was supposedly in favour of the Republic, initially had himself painted for his coronation in traditional monarchical robes. But in this painting from 1812, he wanted to be shown more as a simple soldier with one medal, which he gave to himself, by the way, which is always helpful. But it's in his study, and he wanted to show himself as a working leader, someone that we could trust, who would do the right thing for the people. Did anyone know what he was working on in his study that he wanted to be remembered for? The Civil Code, yes, the French Code. And you can actually see the word code written, or partly written, on this scroll here. But he has a sword on his chair. The chair is covered with all sorts of symbols, like the bee, which was a symbol of Napoleon. He's got various classical images on his desk. But he's also got some books here. So he's a serious reader. He's reading all the law books in order to prepare for his code. And we know that he's been working very hard because the clock says it's 3:15 or 4:15 or something like that in the morning. So he's been up all night, and we know it's been up all night because the candle is nearly burnt down, right? The artist does this for a purpose, right? These are messages that they're telling us, and if we look carefully for them, we can see them. His hair is a bit greasy and messed up because he's been working all night. And he wants to be remembered that even though he might have lost in Moscow, he will leave the code as the lasting symbol of his rule, which is probably wise because that's how it's turned out. Again, you can go into all the detail about the painting if you like on my website. And here's a very similar one about Washington. It's interesting because both of them were military leaders, both of them were instrumental in building the institutions of their country, and they're quite similar. He's got a sword in his hand, but the sword is pointed downwards. Right? He's sort of he's given up being an active warrior. He's now a politician, where there is less need for him to be a warrior. He's been up all night. He's been writing, which historians think that this might be his farewell address, which he gave at the end of his presidential period. Here we have a symbol of the fasces, a bundle of sticks tied together are stronger than one. He has a number of books under the table and also on the table, which that he was reading. The Federalist, that was one of the books that people have been able to identify. He has a chair here with the symbol of the United States, which has been used in the great image of the Great Seal. Through the window here, we can see storm clouds gradually parting. Right, the storm of the revolution against the Brits. And where does the storm? What does the storm lead to? A rainbow. Yes, the future American Republic is this happy, beautiful rainbow of happiness and freedom that's going to be in the offing.
He's also clearly handing over, isn't he?
Yes, he's finished his tour of duty as president and getting ready to hand it over to the next person, which is what Napoleon never did, right? Napoleon never handed over office to anyone else because he was emperor. And again, you can go into more detail if you wish. And I threw in this one of George Herbert Walker because even though it's in 1994, people in power who have who want to be depicted in official portraits choose carefully what they want in their picture. Right? I don't believe it's accidental. Now, when you look at this, he's obviously a working president. This is probably not a pizza menu. This is probably some official document to do with affairs of state. We can't see it so well here because of the lights, but in the background is a famous painting of Lincoln meeting with his generals in the Civil War. And of course, Bush did have some military exploits to his name, and he wanted to associate himself with the great military leader of Abraham Lincoln. And that's why that painting is there.
Is that Ulysses Grant on the right?
Yes, there are three of them actually, and I can't remember, I've got it written down here, I can't remember all three of them. But his head is hiding Lincoln, so I think he doesn't want to give too much prominence to Lincoln, so his head is carefully blotting out Lincoln, possibly as a rival. But he's also got a globe here, which suggests that he's not only just interested in American political affairs, but he has got the affairs of the entire world that he's concerned about. And he wants to remind us of that fact by including that in the picture. Now the tradition is not to have an official portrait made, but an official photograph. So there's less opportunity in that for the symbolism that we get in art, which I think is a great pity. But if you go to the White House webpage, you can see all sorts of pictures that they want you to see. Right? There's carefully selected and composed pictures. So it's quite an interesting study to go and look at that.
Can I just go back to the Bush and the Washington, George Washington? Bush seems to be trying to smile. So it's sort of...
He always had that trouble, didn't he?
Whereas Washington...
He's humorless. Washington is completely humorless, yes.
So is that I mean, they may well be that way, but what about the painter? I mean, is that what the painter wanted to convey?
I think the tradition then was you didn't have a smiling leader in an official painting. Yes. Right? You had to show them as seriously concerned with affairs of state. And to be a joking, humorous leader was not considered...
He's a priest.
Well, look, you can see the distant look in his eyes. He's got the future of America in his days. Very serious. Here's an interesting one that Americans, at the time of the Revolution, had a big debate about whether they should in fact have a monarch instead of a president. And many of the founding fathers were very worried that the office of the president would turn into an elected monarchy. And one reason why they had to introduce the checks and balances was to make sure that this would never ever happen. However, in some popular representations of the president, you do see this. Apotheosis means turning someone into a godlike figure. And Washington was often depicted in a scene like this, being whisked up to heaven. You have the light coming down from heaven. The Kronos and an angel have come to pick him up, and he's already on a fluffy white cloud ready to be wafted up to. And he's got the three graces here, and we see liberty terribly distraught, the Phrygian cap, the spear downwards, the armour that Washington would have had as a general, and even a sobbing Indian who's terribly upset that Washington has died, but perhaps happy that he's going to be taken to heaven. And this appeared in the early 19th century, the apotheosis of Washington. And something similar happened when Lincoln died, after Lincoln was assassinated. This comes from a postcard that was bought in its thousands and circulated. People would send it to each other for remembering Lincoln. And here we have angels in heaven, the light streaming down. Washington's already in heaven, welcoming Lincoln with this wreath of heroism about to be placed on his head. This is a very awkwardly drawn image. I think their embrace is a little bit too intimate, which raises questions that the author probably didn't intend. But when I showed this to some colleagues, their smutty minds immediately thought of other things. There's a more detailed picture about the apotheosis of Washington. But it gets worse. I mean, it's hard to imagine, but it does. This is a huge, huge painting inside the dome of the Capitol building in Washington. Right, this is thousands of feet across. And it shows Washington in heaven, sitting on a fluffy cloud, surrounded by maidens who represent the colonies, with Liberty and I forget who else sitting next to him. And then there's some scenes of American culture and civilization, agriculture and merchant marine and commerce. Here's a close-up of Washington in heaven. He's got a throw rug on him, which is obviously cold in heaven, so you need to have something over your knees. He's got two nubile nymphs on either side, one with the fasces, typical symbol, with a Phrygian cap. He's got a sword in his hand because he was a warrior. But you can see this in the Capitol building, and this was built at huge expense during the Civil War when money was tight, when they had to use every money for the war effort. And here they are expending huge amounts on paying someone to design and paint this rather strange depiction of Washington in heaven. And that's still in the Capitol building. I guess you've got to lie on your back and look up and see it with a pair of binoculars to try and identify all the... And if you did that, you'd be arrested immediately for being a terrorist. And then, of course, we have the cult of Lincoln, which is still very strong in America. And in the Lincoln Memorial, this is a huge, huge statue made in 1922. And I would suggest that in many respects, and you see fasces here again, the Roman symbol, this kind of monumental architecture, I think, would have been very troubling to the American founding fathers, because this is celebrating the man rather than liberty or constitutional government. Right? This is recognising him as a giant man who is like a king or an emperor. Whereas I think some of the founding fathers would have been very concerned about that particular image.
He's not smiling, he's very serious.
Well, he's just been shot, you know, so he's probably not very happy.
Well, if you've been sitting on marble.
Yes, he might have a bad case of piles, you know, from sitting on a hard marble throne like that.
Behind him is Gettysburg Address.
Yes, I think you're right.
Which is, I haven't been there for 10, 20 years, but my memory is not the statue, it's the address.
Yes.
And the address is not a bad set of words, as words go.
But you could look beyond the statue to see the great words and the sentiments
I'm
in
saying that maybe your implied criticism...
too harsh, perhaps.
Maybe just a...
Yes.
The monument itself is not only the statue, it's also words.
Well, it's a whole building, isn't it?
Yeah.
But again, I think the size of it is troubling. You could have had perhaps a more modest and appropriate statue, which wouldn't have taken away from the words of the document.
And was there debate along those lines when it was unwrapped?
No. By that time, the cult of the president had become quite well established. And
If we look at art on its own over the past 200 years,
Yes.
we move from highly subjective images, which are quite unnatural, to the Impressionistic period, all the way to abstract art where no one's interested in the subject anymore whatsoever. How much of that is a liberty story in its own right, and is it associated or influenced by the sorts of images we've been looking at today?
it's very interesting to look at who bought paintings, who paid for it. That's, I mean, something I'm quite interested in. In many of these examples I've given you, it's the ruler himself or the government which has commissioned works like this. A private person probably wouldn't have commissioned something like this. It was for political reasons and a political institution. You might also say that something like Blue Poles, when that was purchased by Gough Whitlam, was enormously controversial. Is it true that only a government could afford to buy a painting like that or would have the gall to do so? One of the things that is interesting about the Impressionist period is that private collectors really drove that market or the sale for those paintings, which is quite interesting. I mean, when did art become public in the sense of requiring dollars to be purchased and to be stored in public museums and art galleries? That's the story of the 20th century. Well, it's partly propaganda, but it's also partly the government acting as a teacher right? That somehow there is this great art that is not going to be appreciated by ordinary people who won't buy it or show it. Therefore, the government has to step in and buy it for us and display it in buildings where we will go, usually at subsidised ticket sales, to appreciate. That's also political, not just what's in the art, but who buys it and who displays it.
We don't have Paul Keating struggling to free the exchange rate as a great European.
Right.
A bit like the protection versus free trade shops. Look, I'm going to have to call it
Yes.
a halt here. I think it's been a marvellous presentation, and more strength to your arm for taking on this task, because I think it's really important. The Daumier caricature with the Pear King reminded me of an incident just in the last week here. The election or whatever of the new Speaker of the House of Representatives was depicted on the front page of the Daily Telegraph as a rat with ears and the tail and the whole thing. So what's he do? He bans photographs taken in the chamber, allowing in one camera, and banned, as I understand it, banned the Daily Telegraph from the public galleries. So there you go.
Well, that'll work, won't it? Yes,
yes. Nothing new under the sun. So thank you very much, Dave.
Oh, good.
Thanks
Well,
for
thank
being
you.
here. That was terrific.